Good morning, everyone. So yes, so it's welcome to Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador's Tourism Awareness Month Tourism Workforce Recovery Session. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Deborah Borden, and I'm the Vice Chair of Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador. I co-own and operate the Anchor Inn Hotel and associated properties in beautiful Twillingate. Thank you for joining us this morning. Before we get started, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the province of Newfoundland and Labrador as the ancestral homes of many diverse populations of Indigenous people who have contributed to 9,000 years of history, including the Beothuk on the island of Newfoundland. Today, this province is home to diverse populations of Indigenous and other peoples. We also acknowledge with respect the diverse cultures and histories of the Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit. Sitting on the board of an organization representing more than 2,700 tourism businesses and organizations across the province, I can truly attest to the fact that the growth and development of tourism industry in this province does not happen by accident. Our very own Juanita Ford has been working on the HR file for Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador for many years and sits on the board of Tourism HR Canada. It is this determined and collaborative effort by many partners and stakeholders at the provincial and national level that propels us forward. On that note of collaboration and partnership, it's time to hear from our speaker from Tourism HR Canada, Philip Mondor. I'm happy to introduce Philip, President and CEO of Tourism HR Canada. For more than 30 years, Philip has worked with labor market stakeholders across Canada and abroad, including foreign governments, pan-global organizations, Canadian and non-Canadian businesses, and various education and training bodies. His work spans over 15 industrial sectors in 11 countries, with most of his career focusing on the tourism industry. Philip is an industry representative to the Deputy Minister's Advisory Council, Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. He is an advisory member of the Labour Market Information Council, the Future Skills Center Research Advisory Board, and the Ted Rogers School of Hospitality and Tourism at Ryerson University. Philip is the recipient of the Ryerson's Ted Rogers Industry Award 2020. Welcome, Philip.
Why, thank you so much, Deborah. What I'm going to do right away is go to share my screen so that I can get started. Well, it is with great pleasure. I thank you very much for the gracious introduction. It's always a pleasure working with the fine folks at Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador. As Deborah said, it's been a relationship with this organization for more than 30 years, and we are very grateful to have Juanita currently represented on our board. Today, what I'm going to do is walk through, I had to be very selective in the kind of information I could supply because, of course, on this topic, there is lots of information. And indeed, you're going to see on the slides that some of the information is a little dense, but I thought it would be helpful to include. And this is all part of a PowerPoint deck that you can access from HNL following the session. So it's a good record and you won't have to take so many notes along the way. Some of the slides I will be fairly quick on. Today, my goal is really to provide a snapshot on the last 15 months of what has occurred in the labor market and tourism and what those impacts mean, but then really shift the focus to where we need to go from here. And of course, the whole lens is around the labor market itself. I encourage you as I'm going through this to think about some questions you may have. We will be opening it up at the end of the presentation for Q&A. And if there isn't enough time to cover all those questions before the end of today's session, I'll be happy to follow up afterwards. So to begin with, it's no surprise, I'm sure you all are well aware that COVID-19 has caused a significant disruption to the labor market. But what does that look like? What I'm going to do is walk you through some of the most current information we have. And I just wanted to draw your attention to where I'm getting that information because there is a lot more there that you can also tap into and access. And in fact, it can also be very tailored to your interest by looking at it from the provincial point of view or from a sector point of view, we've got some tools under our labor market information tab, most notably the tourism employment tracker tool. But there are several other tools that people tend to work with, and I'm just highlighting a few of them there. In this area, you can go and click on a few buttons and instantly get the information, some of which I am presenting today. So let me just show you a quick snapshot on basically the last 12 to 15 months. It was in February, we were tracking to have the highest employment numbers we've seen in this sector for well over 20 years. We had just surpassed the 2 million mark. And the projections for this summer were very promising because the demand for tourism services and products had been growing. However, it was within a very short 10 weeks that we lost 881,000 workers. At the time, that was attributing to about 1/3 of all Canadians who lost their jobs. By the end of August, we had some recovery with the summer that gave us a little bit of an opportunity. But still, we were at 464,000 fewer workers than we normally would have employed. And you can see the gap that occurred over the summer. It was rather bleak. By the end of the season, we had reduced our workforce by still about 450,000 that were still displaced from those original February numbers. And by the way, by that time, just to be very clear, tourism jobs were the ones that remained more displaced than any of the other industries. At 88% of the Canadians that were unemployed at the time were all attributed to this industry. Now, getting a little more current with some data that extends beyond 2020 and moving into 2021, you can see that the unemployment, or rather the employment rates, are still rather suppressed for what's happening in tourism in Canada. And I actually just also pulled a little bit of data to show what that looks like in terms of Newfoundland and Labrador. And basically, the pattern is very similar. And what it represents overall is a reduction of workers by anywhere between 25 and 50%, depending on the particular timeline that you're looking at. And that has been consistent now for nearly 15 or going on 16 months. Not surprising, you're feeling it in your businesses and the challenges that are inherent with it. In terms of sector approach to this, if we look at the 5 industries, they did get hit disproportionately a little different. As of December, the accommodation lost the greatest percentage of employment relative to February. The recreation industry had the second greatest loss of employment. And even in the transportation industry was down by 17.1% overall. Now, those numbers, by the way, are significant for, other than the fact they are big numbers, but those are more than double of any of the other industries that would have been tracked in Canada at the time. And that brings me to this slide. As I said in a previous slide, by December, tourism jobs that were lost represented about 88% of all jobs that were lost in Canada. Today, as of April, we, as an industry, represent 93% of those people that are unemployed out there. Another way to look at this is to know that we, as an industry, when we describe ourselves as hardest hit and going to be the slowest for recovery, this is really a number that you can use to illustrate that. In other words, other industries have recovered more rapidly and been able to bring back a number of their workers much quicker than we have. So of all people unemployed in Canada today, nearly 94% are in this industry alone. And if you look at the unemployment rates as we track them, I only brought it to January here. I didn't have time to add the extra data, but for the most part, the basic message is that tourism has been roughly double the unemployment rate over the rest of the economy. Now, again, being selective with a little bit of information for you, this is an actual screenshot from that employment tracker tool. And here I just wanted to show you that there is also information here that shows other indicators that are driving these trends on employment. So one of them is looking at the number of businesses that have been open and closed in that period of time. Here, I just took an image of Newfoundland and Labrador over that window. you might have noticed in the top right-hand corner, you can do comparisons to what that looks like overall to Canada or to other provinces, and actually to the economy overall. But not surprising, you see a huge spike of business closures over that period that is consistent with the time that we lost a lot of employment. And it still remains quite suppressed, but that's not the whole story. If you really want to get a feel for how severe it was, it's more than just knowing how many businesses remained open or closed, but rather, in fact, how many hours did people work? So here we've got some data in Employment Tractor that show basically comparisons of what it looks like for our sector to other industries. You can do this at the provincial level, but you can also compare this to other provinces and, in fact, to other industries and across Canada. So the only two sections that are close to, don't cover entirely the full tourism sector, but a large percentage of them are the accommodation and food service and the culture and recreation. So just as a general image here, this is how the number of hours played out in the province over this time. But let's compare that to, say, wholesale retail. Those workers were getting more hours. And if we add a little other examples, healthcare was getting even further hours, or even construction was tracking higher. And we could do this for any number of industries. But the real message here is that in this industry, even though we held on to a certain number of workers, even those that are working many fewer hours on average than they would have in under what I call BC before COVID times and relative to other industries. And just so you know, you can do these comparisons to all of the other industries that are trackable. And the ones highlighted were the few that I put on the screen previously. And to add to this narrative, in terms of who was hardest hit, if you look at the industry itself and dig down a little bit, so where were the biggest impacts? Well, this is a rather bleak slide, to say the least. The overall tourism demand was down by 56%, but you can see all of the main commodity areas were really seriously hit. These numbers are unprecedented. And no question, anyone operating businesses in this industry really felt the pain and continued to feel the pain. The only one that showed any little bit of hope and recovery over the summer months last year happened to do with this category called pre-trip expenditures. And basically, you can see the examples of what that applied to. Even then, I might add that that's a relatively modest number of businesses in the big picture. In terms of GDP, another kind of indicator in here, I'm staying on with the bleak message for a little while. Let's just compare 2019 GDP tourism compared to 2020. You can see this is a slide that a lot of politicians and economic people pay attention to. You can see the severe drop and just how we compared last year in 2019 to 2020. It's a drop in the bucket in terms of the revenues we brought in with GDP. And if you look forward so far in this 2021, it remains bleak. And in fact, moving forward, it's not going to get significantly better for some time. Here again, I showed you in that previous slide an overall image of tourism, just all combined. But you can actually go into Tourism Tracker and select any number of these subsectors within the industry and just see how they performed from a GDP point of view, relatively so. And you can compare them across a few sectors if you wish. So what does this tell us about how we're going to recover and the timeline? Again, I've only selected a few bits of information here, but in terms of the accommodation sector overall across Canada, we don't see BC or before COVID numbers until about 2025. And beyond that, we start to see some exponential growth. But it's going to be a relatively slow recovery. And there are lots of different reasons for that. Even if the demand is there for travel and travel services, we will be hampered primarily by factors that are attributed to the workforce. If one of the other sort of narratives that go along with this, and one that I won't spend much time on, but part of the reason why the industry will really struggle from the employment side is because we have the implications really disproportionately in this industry affect a lot of the underemployed and vulnerable workers. Most of those that have been unemployed or been displaced fit into this category, and the kinds of resources and programs needed to bring them back are a little more intensive and more challenging than other populations. This really is a whole presentation in its own right, but that's a little bit of a little glimpse of why there'll be some challenges, and we'll get into some more in a moment. By the way, beyond just looking at accommodation rates, we can look at what that looks like from a revenue or a GDP point of view. And in Employment Tractor, we have examples of this stuff in some of the other economic industries within our sector. So I just use these as examples without burdening you too much, but bottom line, 2024, 2025 start to show us looking at our before COVID window. And in terms of jobs, we will feel the pain. We are feeling the pain currently. And it's going to, I hate being the bearer of all this bad news all the time, but in fact, it's going to become even a tighter labor market and a more difficult time finding workers as we move into 2025 and 2030. The challenge of looking for workers was there long before COVID. We were already tracking with some of the greatest shortages of supply then. In fact, what COVID has done is not only accelerate part of the problem, but made it deeper and wider. So moving forward, the thing that most businesses should be concerned with, other than trying to generally keep their doors open, is where are they going to find their workers? And none of our industries are immune to it, but most definitely recreation and food and beverage will be the ones where it's going to be most difficult. I don't want to spend much time on the next two slides, but I just also wanted to let you know that, of course, some of the programs offered by the federal government, of which we and I know HNL and the national associations and many others have been working very hard with the federal government to implement and to try and help businesses. Some have been quite successful, and take up on those programs has helped many businesses stay afloat. The EI benefits have been particularly important to this industry. And you can see the spikes that accumulated a little bit and why that mattered to us. And of course, even on the wage subsidy, we can see that we also as an industry, were one of the larger recipients, or in terms of businesses, one higher subscribed industries to take up on this. Of course, this is not surprising when you look at the numbers that I showed earlier and being hardest hit. So we can say that a number of those programs the federal government offered were very beneficial and helpful. And indeed, even if you look at the wage subsidy program, the one that was most fundamental, it was again this industry that disproportionately had been one of the larger recipients of it. Still, moving forward, it will not be enough. And there are some changes that are pending on this, with some advocacy work being done by the associations, both provincially and nationally, to try and sustain this at levels that are much higher than needed. And there are other recommendations we have, which I will come to a little bit later in the presentation in a few minutes. Not to belabor a lot of points, I'm using one slide here for encapsulating a very significant study we did put out in February after 5 months of research with market consultation. But bottom line, one of the other compounding problems that we're going to face is that it's not just a numbers game on trying to attract a scarce workforce that's out there, but rather it's also a major reputation and image issue. We as an industry have lost a lot of ground during COVID in terms of this sector being an attractive place to work. It's dropped significantly, both by people who work in the industry and would not recommend it, but also by general perceptions by those who've never worked in industry and attitudes about the sector. There are many data points here about why that's the case, and I could encourage you to go look at our study if you want more. So moving forward, what are we going to do about all this when chronic shortages are one of the problems? But I got to tell you, it's not the only problem. And the bottom line is we know that it's going to be a long and protracted recovery. And this is going to be largely because we have difficulty finding workers. And most vulnerable workers are the ones that have been most impacted. So we are going to have to look at strategies that are going to address these issues at a scale that's larger than most industries because of the sheer size of the tourism workforce, which represents roughly 10% of the labor market. Now, to look at this quickly, I always use this slide as a frame. It's a good sort of framework to get you thinking about the kinds of issues we have, and it's more than supply. Bottom line, when you look at workforce issues, there are basically three fundamental areas that tend to show up as areas we need to address to help make sure that we have a resilient, productive, and inclusive workforce. One of them is supply. And we've been talking a lot about supply so far. Indeed, we need workers and we need the right number of them. So it all starts there. But it's not only a question of supply. We also need to make sure we have people with the right skills. And we also need to make sure we can get those people in the places where we need them. So these three dimensions inform most of the kinds of programs, policies, and strategies necessary to help with workforce recovery. Nearly every issue you can identify as that we're challenged with on the workforce front will fit into one of these three areas. So when we look at things like Budget 2021, or we're investigating strategies to help with recovery or other issues, then we are basically looking at these three dimensions. With that in mind, we've published a number of research elements over the life of COVID, but most recently, we did put out a workforce recovery strategy, and it's encapsulated into these four pillars. I'll be relatively brief here. I just want to walk you through some of the quick things here because these are some of the areas that emerged from intensive and extensive market research by talking to employers through town hall meetings, by looking at secondary and tertiary research, by looking at the different strategies that were in play, et cetera. So there's a lot of work we need to do. And it started off with this issue of supply in the broad terms. Here, and what you saw on this slide are some of the main activities. I gotta tell you, for each one of those headlines, there are several subpoints within it. An example of worker retention strategies, we talk about the need for recall programs. For example, redeployment and reemployment. And that kind of thing is the stuff that we now see showing up in the Budget 2021, although we think the program is not exactly the right kind of structure, but there's lots of activity here that are important, including extension of wage subsidy, a dedicated immigration pathway, a new student work placement program, which we're proud to say we'll be announcing in the near future because we've been given the funding by the federal government to mount that program. So there are many initiatives within here. I don't have time to go through each of those in today's brief webinar, but we do have far more detail of this in other webinars and on our website. And also you can get it through H&L by asking them. They'll be happy to connect with us. So various strategies within there. The point being that we need to, within this overall area, prioritize the idea of bringing people back. Those furloughed workers and the need to attract new workers is fundamental, and it really does boil down to that as a main objective. We also know that doing that means we need to prioritize tapping into new Canadians and Indigenous peoples. They're some of the only workforce that is truly available just because of dwindling a domestic supply of workers. Youth is also important, but I want to stress the point that that population, which you may have relied on, continues to be a dwindling population. Basically, it's a much smaller pool than before. And within this strategy, we do have to overcome a reputational program. So there's more to be said there, but because of time, I've kept it brief, and hopefully the deck will spark a few ideas for you, or at least remind you that you can go and check out some of that information from our report that we supplied at a forum about 7 weeks ago. On the skills front, there is a lot of need around the skills issue because, of course, the workforce has changed. The workplaces have changed. Markets have changed. We have done a series of webinars on the skills issue itself. Again, it's free, it's accessible, it's online. They're all taped. You can go and tap into them. But the bottom line here is really a need to do some upskilling and reskilling. And that needs to take on many different forms and has to be accessible. And to be very clear, the real needs here transcend frontline workers. The bigger needs, in fact, are with the management teams. And these are necessary because of major business shifts that have occurred. So we're going to rely heavily on learning as a point of reference. And we've got to focus a lot on what it takes for the management and operational teams. This organization has done a lot to provide free training. Our two websites at the moment have free tools available to business owner operators. There's a tourismrecovery.ca. And just last week, we launched Business Builders, which is an entirely updated and revamped program, micro learning with a lot of tools available. It is free and accessible to you. Just have to sign on before September if you want it for free. You'll have 1 year's access. After September, it will then go as a fee for service. Again, if you don't have information on it, please connect with H&L or send me a note afterwards. But there's a lot of product there. It's all been market tested. It's all based on demands set up by the industry. And that will help with the training needs that you can start today with downloadable tools to help you cope and manage with recovery. On the sentiment front, as I mentioned earlier, we are really concerned about the reputational image that has occurred and how this is going to continue to plague this industry and create a scenario where it's very difficult to compete. Because of this, we need good information that keeps you abreast of activities. And we know we've got to tackle this challenge of these workers who are not going to return. This is an alarming concern for us. The research that has gone into this has really been stark and worrisome. So there are a number of strategies that we've recommended around this. They include community-based approaches, dealing with improved workplace scenarios, workplace conditions, but really mounting a campaign. We are currently in discussions with the federal government to help with some of these things, but it's an area where money seems to be a little less accessible. One good point here is we talked about community partnerships and community strategies as a key important variable, one that was essential, and we do see budget 2021 that has included money for those activities, which we will be tapping into. So there's much to be said about each of these again, but these are some of the main points that come out of it. And finally, this did distill finally to a view that what we really need is to make sure that we're more engaged at the policy level, at the in federal departments and boardroom tables in business offices. And so a lot of this is also distilled into the need to find a way to become involved in designing of a national strategy that aligns with the national tourism strategy for marketing, but really is a partner document around a national or federal strategy around the labor market. This matters because it will help leverage resources at the local level and ensure that the programs we move forward with have the coordination and coherence necessary. And this is where I will segue to say, this is where H&L becomes very important to you in the province, because as our direct partner, it's that coordination of these labor market issues that make a difference. These things don't happen on their own. We can help design the tools and figure out what needs to be done, but it's all about boots on the ground that make it happen in the market. So with that, Craig, I'm going to flip it to you now. I didn't want to use more time than I was supposed to. I did, of course, have a few Q&As in here, but I thought we'd leave a little more time for that if possible, and I can move back to this presentation if needed to support a few of the Q&A if we want to use those, or we'll see if there's any that's come up.
Excellent. And Philip, thank you again. You're always on top of this, and your presentation of the subject area it makes it understandable to me. So you do a very good job of imparting this. Certainly, as you indicated, you've been, and Tourism HR Canada has been a long-standing partner with H&L, and the importance, I think, of the HR issue has really come to light. even at the national table, when I'm meeting with the advocacy groups, it's been a lot of talk about liquidity, but in the last little while, it's been very HR focused as well because it presents a big challenge. Attendees, the registrants, there's a question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. So if you have a question for Philip, please put it in. I will go through those and answer as they come in accordingly. But Philip, I guess a couple of questions that
or enough the challenge we are going to have moving forward in terms of finding workers. This question you have is actually a very insightful and important one because, and in fact, the challenge with answering it is that it's also quite a complex one. Look, on the base, some basic things to start off with. First of all, the supply of workers is dwindling and much smaller than we realize. That may seem paradoxical or contradictory or maybe not obvious to people because we hear about all those high unemployment numbers. So how do you reconcile all these so-called unemployed people and yet say you've got labor shortages? Well, there's lots of reasons that these people who are currently displaced are not taking jobs. But even if we could absorb all of those workers, we still have many fewer workers than what the demand is. So COVID, in fact, has created an environment where the competition for scarce labor has only grown or become more acute or more difficult. And this industry, because it lags recovery compared to others, is going to feel even more pain around this because that pool of workers or that supply will continue to dwindle further. Now, on this front, Craig, I guess I'm going to go back to sharing the screen for a moment because I did prepare just a slide or two on some of the main reasons with this. So bear with me for a moment. It's worth the trouble to put it up if that's okay.
We're here to learn, sir.
So just got to get to the right slide. So look, this reminds me, and I put this as one of the first questions because I got to tell you, I don't think there's a day literally that goes by where I don't get a question of this type. And these are the way it's often asked. Where are the workers? You know, what is it? What are we talking about when we say we have labor shortages when there's all these unemployed people and so on? Or why am I having difficulty finding workers? And by the way, for those of you that would have been part of our survey work, and there was well over 6,000 survey respondents to this area of inquiry, we were seeing these problems even last summer, let alone now. But here are some of the reasons, and this is not all of them, but I just happen to have this convenient slide. Look, part of it is what I described earlier to Craig about a dwindling supply and a lagged recovery. So the competition for that workforce that's available is there. But there's a lot of other reasons. With COVID, the spotlight on this industry, which is all very human interaction based and service based, means that the ways that people look at the job opportunities are quite different. They're concerned about the risk of going to work because of the spread of COVID. And believe me, they are feeling very nervous about that. And we're not going to have COVID behind us for some time, even with vaccinations in play. And it may not be a risk to themselves, but they may be living with people that are in high risk propositions. But also it's displaced the family unit's work environment overall. And so they're recalibrating who's going to work, how much work they can do. They don't necessarily have the same access to care. They may be caring for elderly people. They are also facing a lot of mental health issues, so they're not ready to return, and so on. We have actually articles on this and more detail than what the slide produces for you. But let me just tell you that there are probably 15 key factors that are attributing to this issue. The one that we're a little more worried about recently is the competition from other sectors, because all these other factors indeed are of concern, and they're going to continue to be a concern. But what we're also seeing is ramped up efforts by other industries to attract as many workers from our sector as possible, because they recognize that the skills they have are very commodifiable or very much of interest, particularly in the health industry. And I just have to say here that we're seeing government money, both at the provincial and federal level, going to initiatives that are very much targeted at this industry to reskill them or skill them to work in other industries, like take them away from us and put them elsewhere. This is of great concern. So look, there's a lot of points here. One of the other things I've got to add to this, though, is that there is a major responsibility on the part of the employer to look at how they can change a number of their HR practices and the conditions of work environment that will actually make them a far more attractive place. So I'm going to flip through the next few slides very, very quickly, but I just want you to know that on our website, we do have information on this, and we have tools like on tourism recovery on how you can help with bringing people back and some good practices that are recommended. These are all free and they're downloadable with some instructional tools for you, some quick checklists. So if you are struggling, there are some things you can already tap into that are no cost and really designed for the small, medium operator to work with. And there's also tips on what you can do if you've got people that are choosing not to return, and what it looks like in terms of some practical tips and solutions. So I'll leave that one there. But you know what, just because I've now moved into the sharing thing, Craig, I'm going to move on to my only other question I included in the deck, the way to prompt this, because I'll be quick with this, because this is another one I get asked a lot about, because people are now moving into that recovery mode. And then I can close this deck and not bother going back and forth. But I do also get this question about vaccination, because we know the industry will start to reopen, and it has, spottedly across Canada. And if we're lucky, as the Prime Minister said, we'll see more of that over the fall, over the summer and into the fall. But this is with the understanding that vaccination levels are still one vaccination for 70% of the population, or whatever the metric is. And so it starts to become a question, really, can you demand that staff be vaccinated before they return to work? And employers are asking these questions because they're trying to mitigate legal concerns, or they're trying to mitigate other risks. And of course, they're trying to make sure they're safe workplaces. Well, the quick answer to this is no, you cannot force an employee to be vaccinated. But the fun answer to this is, however, you can implement policies that require people to be vaccinated to remain employed. Now, that may sound contradictory, but it's not exactly. It really is about instituting a policy and then giving and then providing the right kinds of supports and time to enable people to become vaccinated if it becomes a requirement. And this is something that we see happening more in sectors like ours because of the high level of contact points. Now, this is all based on following labor laws and meeting the conditions of human rights and so on. And each province, of course, has slightly different law on these things. So you do need to do your homework. And we do have a good source for that. But the bottom line is, you can't force people, but you can create policies and tools to get them there. And ultimately, you can furlough people or leave them unemployed, or leave them unpaid for a while if they don't meet your standard. So that might not be always the best way to answer it, but that question comes up quite often. And now I'll stop sharing again.
No, and I think that's one that we've heard a good few times, actually, Philip. So that kind of clarification is excellent. I guess just to put you on the spot a little bit, have you heard of a particular operator who might have had an innovative strategy or solution? Anything that pops to mind and says, wow, that was unique?
I think that this all sounds so basic to me, but it seems that the operators that have succeeded most with a quicker rebound of their workforce have been those operators that have followed good practice and are exemplary with HR in the first instance. I don't know how many of your audience remembers the Employer of Choice program and some of the recommendations that were in there, but those stand perhaps more true than ever today. In the end, workers are looking for employers that can afford, that can provide the kind of flexibility that they need, particularly in difficult times like this. They want flexible work hours. They want more predictable employment conditions. If they're going to be asked to do new work, they want the supports for the right kind of training and so on. You know, it's funny, these practices were recommended long before COVID as destinations for employment or employer of choice locations. Well, now they ring more true than ever. You know, if anything, that COVID has really, I think, highlighted how important it is that the employee really takes charge of their employment track and has the kinds of conditions that fit their work style needs, because they're coping with many other challenges outside of the work environment. And so when I look at good practice, Craig, it has to do with the employers that are really, really employee centric. You know, one of the messages I often say to people is you're not really in the business of tourism. And I don't mean it quite like that. What I'm really trying to get at is you're in the business of managing people, because your whole product is dependent on that. And so, you know, in the end, it's about good HR practices. And there too, I would recommend going to the tools that H&L has and those that we offer, because that's the employers that are benefiting.
Excellent. Thanks very much for that. And again, just a reminder to everyone, that question and answer box is at the bottom. Robin Spracklin is asking, isn't the federal government still offering CERB to individuals? And if so, isn't that a reason why we are looking for staff?
Well, CERB was, I like the question, and I think it's a very important one. It's also one we do get asked. You know, there was in our survey work, we did actually look at this very question, because it was a major concern, particularly last summer when CERB was introduced sometime in mid to late June, and the take-up was very high. And then you heard in the retail industry, and in this industry in particular, that it was a disincentive for people to return to employment, because the benefits through CERB were more reliable and predictable, and potentially more earnings than if they were going back to work. There is probably true, but it turns out not as big of impact as we would have thought. The reality is most of these people did not have jobs to return to. Those that were retained ended up having full-time hours, and in fact, more than full-time hours, because employers stuck with what we call an anchor team or a core team, and made sure that they were as adaptable and flexible to as many work conditions and jobs. You know, they did all kinds of things, right? And so that was how they guaranteed them the hours and the flexibility. So in the end, it turns out not many, it was not a disincentive for that many that had job opportunities. Moving into the fall, the program will be weaned out. At least that's the current model around it. So at some point, people will just be transitioning to EI, and it'll follow the regular EI benefit scheme. So that's no different than would have been pre-COVID or BC before COVID. And at some point, we'll start to just see CERB no longer available. So the conditions are equalizing out, if you want, or they're phasing out. So it's not a concern moving into this summer per se. So I don't know if that answers it wholly, but it turns out it wasn't as much of an impact as you might have thought.
Yeah, it probably feels more acute when you're trying to find employees, though.
Yeah, you know, and to be fair, I got to tell you, a number of employers also promoted CERB as an option for their workers that they really knew they could not guarantee stable employment with. I mean, it's a real challenging challenge. You know, you don't want to bring people back and then have to lay them off again or have uncertainty with hours. So we do know that employers also use CERB as a way to try and benefit those displaced workers as much as they can. So, I mean, you know, there is a balancing act to be had there.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things we keep hearing, the outreach team, as we're talking to operators, is that people are advertising open positions, but they're not getting people with proper qualifications. Any thoughts, strategies, magic bullets that you might have in your arsenal?
Well, I got to tell you, I think that in a province like Newfoundland and Labrador, and in particular in rural Canada, in broad terms, that's where the challenge is more acute, because the scarcity of those workers is the reality. And one of the big reasons why that's even more of a challenge today than it would have been BC is because mobility has been hampered. Like mobility is one of those areas where people cannot move around. So where you were able to bring in seasonal workers from like the student populations or from other corners of Canada or international students or the like, that pool has now diminished significantly. So when it comes down to it, in rural areas, when you've already got a small population to draw from, you even have a much smaller population with the kinds of skills necessary to do the work that you need. So it really puts the noose around this. It makes it even more challenging. So what have employers been doing? Well, I mean, there's the classic old approach of providing skills and training, which is necessary for sure, and that can go a long way. But there's also been the introduction and larger investments in digitalization and technology to help augment work so that fewer workers can still deliver on a number of the same services. And so that can help. Or you can also use it to develop programs or products or services that may not rely so much on staff. Like, for example, we saw in Atlantic Canada groups doing things like guided tours that were all virtual without needing to have the interpreter do it. Now, it's not the same experience, but it is an option, right? And it may not be ideal, but for some markets, it made sense. So you're seeing, I mean, there's a whole other webinar I did and a speech I did with OECD about 5 weeks ago around digitalization and how it's impacting the workforce. But that's how a lot of people are responding to this at this time. And we see in the data an increased amount of the use of technology and digitalization to augment and to add to what's happening in the workforce as a result. So if you want, Craig, that could be another time for me to come back and talk about that very topic for this audience, because there's quite a bit of depth to it.
We'd certainly welcome that, Philip. And I think that's one of the other things we're hearing from industry. With all of the training that's required now, most of that is done in a virtual format. And the employees do not necessarily have the skills to be able to participate in those virtual formats and platforms. Are you hearing that? Any ideas around that? Any comment?
Absolutely, Craig. And so there's another thought we've had about this, and we've seen it play out quite well. The virtual format still contains, I'll reframe this. There's no question that not everyone can work online effectively with that virtual format for different reasons. Sometimes it's just a technology issue, sometimes it's a literacy issue, or it might be just the way that they prefer to learn and assimilate information, or whatever the reason may be. But what can be done and has been very successful is you can still have forums just like this, just like it would feel like you're having your regular gathering. And instead of relying on the learner or the worker to go and access this information and assimilate it all on their own, instead it can become conversational. You can have one person serve as the facilitator who actually still uses the same online learning platform with all the same information, but instead it becomes a conversation. It becomes something done in a forum format. And you attach them to mentors or to other colleagues and make it conversational and just regular gatherings. It just demystifies the need to understand the technology or even the complexity that might be part of the learning. It just has to be brought into the environment of a conversation. And someone can lead that is a little more apt to work that way. So the tools are still useful, even if it's not the learner themselves that become the interface with it.
Great answer. We had a fantastic webinar on Friday morning, I believe, with Amber Mack, who talked about digitalization and digitizing or finding a technical solution for tasks, not necessarily full positions. And Robin just pointed out again, Robin Sprackland, that digital is not an option for food preparation in a restaurant. But she also asked a very specific program kind of question. I don't know if you have the answer. How many hours are confirmed for people for unemployment benefits in the coming year?
I'm sorry, I don't have that information handy. And because there's been some recent changes there, I'm reluctant to say what I can recall, but we can get that information for you.
Okay, and we can follow up on that too, Robin, in our email out. Stephen House is saying, are you saying that we're having a work shortage with so many people not working?
Well, this hampers back to the earlier comments about it. Many of those people not working are not ready to return to work, cannot return to work, don't have the right skills, they're not in the right place. Um, there's a lot of factors. It's not just that because the jobs are there that they flock back to them. And so that's a big part of the narrative. By the way, there is something, there are unemployment rates. There's always a structural unemployment level that exists where basically something like 6 or 7% of those unemployed are effectively, that is the bottom. It doesn't get a whole lot lower than that. So there's always a percentage of workers that are not likely to find employment for various reasons. But it's the other group of unemployed people today that could be employed if the conditions were right. And those are the ones where they're not returning yet because there's not enough hours, they're not in the right place, their jobs have changed, they don't have the right skills, and so on. So that's part of what that earlier slide was trying to articulate.
Excellent. I can't believe it. Someone just texted me and said my audio wasn't very loud. I think it was the first time that I've ever been told I'm not loud enough. I guess there's always a first. So I guess, Philip, when you're thinking about this, it's about scale. And I'm hearing an awful lot of people saying in the great year of pivot and pivot again, they've rethought really what their business is. And sometimes they want to scale back. I think that's legitimate in an individual decision, but I'm wondering, what is the lost revenue potential? I don't know if you have that big number or some thoughts around that. If we cannot get the HR requirements, and what could be lost to our GDP?
We actually have very specific data on that. That employment tracker tool actually has that data, and you can look at it very specifically for Newfoundland. In fact, you can look at it for accommodations in Newfoundland to give you some indication of that. And so, I just encourage you to go and check out the employment tracker tool for that point. Look, it makes me think of something else, Craig, that I think is, I'll try to word. It's a little tricky here, but look, one of the things that is the reality is that all of our businesses acknowledge the need to design their new operations or their new business models in ways that are more nimble and more resilient. Because this disruption we had has been very painful and it's been protracted or very long. But we also know moving forward that it won't be the first time, right? There could be other reasons why we get these displacements, hopefully not quite as severe as this or as long as this. But what lesson have we learned? We need to design how we manage our business such that we can be more resilient and remain profitable. So businesses themselves have to learn to be able to scale up and scale down. And that's really what the operational shift has been. And so, what you do with your business model is really to think about it from that lens. So that's giving we have more tools in tourism recovery on things like how do you tap into new markets? How do you increase your market? How do you decrease your market? How do you manage your cash flow in tight situations? How do you tap into other funding sources that you would traditionally not have done so? So these are all of what it's going to take to be business savvy in the new tourism environment. We cannot escape that. If we are optimistic, the rebound is going to be big or potentially big and scalable if we can serve it. But if we can't, how do we manage that, right? And we think that in the end, we can only scale it so much because we just have so many people. But there will be other dry points. So bottom line, this is about businesses adapting their model so that they can scale up and scale down and adjust. And there's good practices and there are tools to help with that. Again, I send you to tourismrecovery.ca.
Speaking about strategies, any thoughts right now on some best practices around recruitment? And I know number one on your list is going to be to register and have a booth in H&L's virtual job fair, which is taking place the month of May. How is that for shameless promotion?
I think, by the way, these job fairs are really, really fundamental, particularly in provinces like Newfoundland, because in the end, like I earlier mentioned, you're dealing with a finite labor pool, particularly in rural areas. And so they're just looking for how they can connect with the employment opportunities easily. And that's the quickest tool and the quickest access point to it. I think employers also have to think beyond what they would have relied on in the past, and acknowledge as well that they can't do what they've done and expect the results to be the same moving forward. Like, you're not going to have students showing up at your door with resumes asking for jobs this year. There are just many fewer of them. So social media, friends of friends, by the way, are one of the biggest network areas, other perks. And I got to put the mention out here of one thing that's starting to show up more and more is more competitive compensation is going to make a difference. I know that that's scary to some, especially when they're really struggling financially. But if it's not a competitive salary or package, it will also diminish the number of people that are coming to you. You know, the reality is other businesses in your neighborhood, even in very rural areas, are going to be more attractive to these workers if you're not competitive.
Thanks, Philip. So much to hear and learn. It was a great presentation, and we thank you so much. And also thank you to the Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador team for organizing the event, and for the crew at Eastern Audio for your technical support this morning. There's a lot of great learning and information sessions booked for the next 2 weeks through Tourism Awareness Month. So please check them all out at our website, hnl.ca. Also, reach out to any member of the Hospitality NL team if you would like any further information on what was discussed this morning. And thank you so much for being here. Goodbye and have a great day.